Welcome to part 2 of image processing with Affinity Photo. We'll continue where we left off in the first tutorial, and we'll have a closer look at some of the tools that are found along the left hand side. We can call this Affinity's toolbar. In the first tutorial I ran through these quickly just to give you an idea of some of the things that are found here, but now we'll actually have a quick look at these in a little bit more detail. And we'll start off with one of the most useful ones found here, which is the light and shadow, or shadows highlights tool, and I've got it down here at the bottom of the toolbar. If we click on that, it brings up this menu. We have it roughly divided into two parts: the shadows strength and range at the top and the highlight strength and range at the bottom. There's a couple of things I'd like to draw your attention to. If we come up to where it says version, it opens under default, but there is another option there which is just labelled as 1.6, and I found that this does tend to give a slightly better result than the default opening of the menu, so I'd recommend you switch to that. And the other thing is, along the bottom here we have these little blue and white buttons. These allow us to have a split view of the image showing the before and after effect, and I'll come on to that in just a second, but for now we can have a look at the sliders. Now, this image of the Rosette Nebula was taken with a hydrogen alpha filter using the Chile 2 telescope, and it's a very high quality image. You can see the majority of the nebula contained within the frame here, but there's also darker sky around at least three of the corners here. The nebula extends a little bit further down here. So we can use the shadows strength slider to bring some of this fainter nebulosity into view. Now, as I click on this and bring it over, you should be able to see that the overall image is getting lighter, but it is actually bringing out this very faint nebulosity. That's probably a bit too much because we don't want to over brighten the nebula at this stage, but we can apply something like that. And the range slider, I think, just dictates brightness values of the pixels that are to be moderated by the shadow strength slider. So if we take this right the way down, when we use the shadow strength slider, we're only working on a particular tonal value, and I think that's probably improved the image. If we take the shadows range right up, it tends to just brighten everything, which is not really what we want. So let's take that down, and we can keep the shadows strength up, just something like that for now. I'll bring the histogram as always onto the screen, just so we can monitor to make sure that we're not clipping the image in any way, shape or form. We have a little bit of headroom here, probably a bit too much, but we'll deal with that in a minute. This is the black side of the image, and this is the white side, and this is showing the pixel distribution at particular values. Now, if we come back to the shadows highlights menu, I can adjust the highlights strength, and basically as we move the slider over to the right, it's actually backing off the highlights. So I think with this image, to be honest, we don't really need to do any adjustments to the highlight values at the moment. A few minutes back I mentioned the idea of having a split screen option here, and this is really good because, as you can see, there is a division along the image with after on the left and before on the right, and we can click on this and then just move it backwards and forwards. So for example, if you look at this part here, this was the original image, and as we move the slider over, you can see the adjustments we've made using the shadows strength slider, and this is really great for assessing the strength of the filter we're just applying. This before and after view is very intuitive, and if you don't like it, you can just click on there again, and click on this one, it just takes you back to the modified image. At the moment the image might appear a little bit light, but I think, as I previously mentioned in the first Affinity Photo tutorial, there's a fantastic tool in here which can really give this image a kick. Particularly after we've applied the shadows strength slider to brighten this, and of course it's the clarity tool. I can remove this for now. We can just click apply, and that's applied the effect to the image. Now we'll come up to filters, sharpen, and then go across to clarity, and it brings up this very simple clarity slider. If I back it down to 0, this is the image with no modifications to it. And I'll just zoom in a little bit so we can look at the effect, and as I move the clarity slider over, you should notice the contrast of the image is improving, and the sharpness of, for example, these lovely dust nebulae and the lovely lots of brighter parts of the nebulosity down here. So by taking this up, it's really improved the image, and once again any of these menus that have these little buttons down here means we can click on here and we can certainly see the before and after now. There's no doubt in my mind that the clarity slider is one of Affinity Photo's most powerful tools. It's a very clean filter. I think I mentioned that in the first tutorial. So we'll apply that. Okay, and as always I like to show you the before and afters, for example where we first came in with the image. So let's just get that on the screen, and off screen I'll use the history function just to click back to where we came in, and that's where the image was when it was first opened, and just 2 adjustments have done that to it, and I think that really has made it a very dramatic image. We've still got our little bit of headroom here, but I can deal with that in a minute. In fact we can do it now. Let's call up the levels adjustment layer. So I've got a shortcut for that as usual, Control L, and this brings up the levels slider, and we can bring the black point over to darken the image a little bit, and that, again, that makes it look very dramatic. As before, if we click merge, it'll just apply the effect to the particular layer that we're working on. In fact, I'll do that. We don't need an adjustment layer particularly. Here's the before and the after that adjustment. So it's just darken the sky background. It's tightened up the histogram nicely. We've still got this little bit of headroom here, but we can keep that there. That's absolutely fine. Now we can have a look at a couple of other tools which I covered briefly in the first tutorial. Those 2 tools are the dodge brush tool and the burn brush tool. Now the dodge tool allows you to lighten parts of the image selectively, and just below it the burn brush tool allows you to darken parts of the image. So let's have a look at a part of the image, say where we'd like to maybe just increase the visibility of some of these darker parts of the nebula. So we'll start off with the burn tool, and the idea is you pick a brush size that suits the feature you plan to be working on. So if we're working on, say, these bits down here, and when we apply the brush it will darken these quite selectively. You just use a brush size that's big enough to work on those particular parts. We don't really work on anything that's around it. And what we have to do first of all is select from up here where it says tonal range. There are 3 options: shadows, midtones and highlights. And at the moment we've got shadows selected because we're working on the dark parts of the image, these lovely dark dusty nebulas. And then also important up here is the opacity slider. If you click on the downward pointing arrow, it brings up a slider as you see here. I'm going to back that right down to something like, let's try about 4%. And when we click on our image, we'll be making a very small tonal adjustment, and it is quite small, to just darken parts of the nebula. So let's click back a few steps and see what that's done. Very subtle. Can you see how it's darkening that dark nebula? So maybe we'll take this up a tad just for drama. Let's take it up to, well, let's try 13 and see what happens. Find a nice piece of nebulosity. We can bring this right down, and then I think you can see the effect is actually much more dramatic now. So we're just working on these dark parts of the nebula. I'll make the brush a little bit bigger for this one. And you may be able to see that if I enlarge the brush size, as the brush moves over the image, it's already applying the effect before I've actually clicked on it. And this is an excellent way of just previewing the part of the nebula that you're working on to make sure that, for example, the strength of the opacity slider isn't too strong. Very, very useful feature in Affinity. So let's take that down a bit. We just apply a little bit more here just to give you an idea of what's actually happening. Oh, there's a nice bit there. Yeah, we can use that. Darkening these bits, and if I click back to where we started, it's working only on the dark parts of the nebula, and this is exactly what we wanted to do. You can see those bits just darkening nicely. So it's a very subtle tool, but it does apply a lot of oomph to the image if you apply it carefully to these relevant parts of the image. Now conversely, with the dodge tool, we can work on the lighter parts of the image. The principle is the same. As we come up to the toolbar options along the top, we have, in this case, midtones selected, so we'll be looking at some of these fainter parts of the nebula. The idea is to try and bring them into prominence, perhaps this bit up here. So we select midtones. The other options of course are shadows and highlights, as we had with the other tool. I've set the opacity to 14%, that's just the same. So if I come into these parts here, what we should see is just a gentle brightening, clicking over it with the mouse, and yeah, can you see it's very subtle, and that's exactly what we want. We don't want to make this any part of this image look artificial or artificially processed. We're just working on these tiny little features of interest. Let's have a look at that. Yeah, just bringing it into brightness. And of course, when you work on your own data, you can change these options. You could increase the opacity for a much more dramatic effect, and of course you can also work to lighten the background. So for example, if we find a bit of background that's, might be able to see that it's just brightening this bit here, let's just check that. Yeah, just brightening the whole area there. And again, it's very useful if you just want to bring some of these fainter bits into visibility. We can also do minor cosmetic correction on the image. Now this is probably the wrong image to demonstrate this to you, because it's such a clean data set that the calibration frames were very good, and there's really not much residual stuff left in the image that we don't want. But there are a few hot pixels, as you can see here. Now you could use the clone tool, that's found over here, very useful tool, and the idea is you click nearby to the offending hot pixel, select a tonal area that's similar to what's around the pixel, and just click on it and it's gone. If you move across the image, this healing brush is quite intelligent, so even though I selected on a different part of the image, it's very good at replacing it with a kind of average value. So you can see it's working very well here. Now I'm actually going to undo that, because if you're working with a data set that has more than its fair share of hot pixels, and this will happen occasionally, sometimes it's easier to use a global tool to address them all in one go, rather than laboriously going through and removing them one by one with the healing brush tool. And a very good tool in Affinity to do that is known as the Dust and Scratches tool, and it's accessed under Filters, come down to Noise, and then go across, and right down near the bottom is Dust and Scratches. Now it brings up this menu, only two sliders to look at here, and once again we've got these features down here so we can do the split view if we wish. And the idea is that you first of all select a radius to suit the features you're trying to remove from the image, and these are just individual hot pixels. So we could use a value of 1 or a value of 2, and once you've set that, and you can use the slider to do that, but I find that the slider's a little bit coarse, so sometimes it might be easier just to click in the box and we'll just type in 1 and hit enter, and it's put the value of 1 in there. Now below that is the tolerance slider, and this is where things get really interesting, because basically this is a kind of strength filter. If we put it right up to 100%, there's probably nothing has happened to the image at all. But as we bring the tolerance slider over towards the left, at some point the pixels will start to disappear. You can see them almost one by one just disappearing off the screen. And what I also recommend is that when you're moving this tolerance slider over, once these pixels have disappeared, stop, because if you take the tolerance slider all the way over to the left, it does affect some of the star images, and it does actually blur the image quite significantly, and we've got very sharp image here, so we don't need to do that. So once again we'll take this back up. You can see a few of these hot pixels scattered around the screen, and once again as I've dragged the slider over to the left, they're just starting to disappear. So we've pretty much got rid of most of them there, and I think that something like that would work well. I've stopped at 21%, and it seems to have shifted most of them. I can't see any, maybe a few fainter ones lying around, but as I say, by leaving the tolerance a slightly higher value, we've just applied the effect to the strength that we need without going any further, and I recommend that you always do that. Don't be tempted to take the tolerance right over to the left. Then we can click apply, and the effect has been applied to our image, so that's looking quite good. For the second part of this tutorial, I'd like to run through the procedure with you for creating an RGB file. Now, to be fair, in Affinity it's quite a difficult and convoluted process, but hopefully if I run through this successfully you can refer to this in the future and it will start to make a bit more sense once you've run through it a few more times. We have our 3 RGB pre-prepared TIFF files ready on the screen. What we're looking at the moment is an image of the lovely galaxy NGC 5128 or Centaurus A, imaged with the Chile 1 telescope. Now these images have been pre-prepared in PixInsight in this case, but you can do the same thing with your own data set using FITS Liberator. Try to scale the 3 images similarly in terms of the sky background, and it does make life easier when we come onto this stage here. So we've got the 3 images open on the screen. I've highlighted the red component. You'll definitely need to have the layers menu visible on the screen and the channels menu at the same time, and if you haven't got those visible and you're not sure how, come up to where it says view, scroll down to studio, and there's a list of all the different options that are available here, and one of them will be channels, which I've already got highlighted and selected, and the other one is layers. Again, I've got them both on the screen already. If you want to remove them from the screen, just do the same thing again and untick the appropriate menu. So let's get started with this, and I say it's quite a convoluted process, but let's see how we get on. So once we have the layers and channels menus open on the screen, the first thing we can do is come up to our red component, and in Affinity we don't need to select the image if we're going to copy it into the clipboard. We can literally just use, for example, edit copy to place it into the clipboard, or I use Ctrl+C as a keyboard shortcut. So it's done that, and then we come up to File and New from Clipboard. So basically what will happen is it will create a new image from whatever's contained within the clipboard, in this case our red component, and you can see the untitled new file just up here. So this is just our red image, but this is a monochrome image at the moment. Because we're going to be working on colour data, we have to come up to where it says Document, come down to Convert Format, click on that, and from the top options select RGB 16. It does bring up some other options down here. These are kind of sort of calibration features, and the one at the bottom here is the one I always tend to use, so I'll highlight that and just click on Convert. So now our untitled image is an RGB file, but it's just containing the red image at the moment. So we're finished with the red component. We can close that down to just help declutter the screen, and then we'll click up here where it says background to just rename this component. It's just a single click on there, and let's call this R, and then hit return, and that's saved that's associated this image with this R, so we can keep track of which one's which. Then we come to the green component, and as before we'll do Ctrl+C to copy it into the clipboard, back to our untitled image, and then Ctrl+V to paste the green component on top of the red. And once again, let's name this so that we can keep track of what's what. We've done that. We can close the green component down. Once more, click on the blue, Ctrl+C to copy it into the clipboard, back to our untitled image, Ctrl+V to paste it in. Here's our third channel. We just click on it once, call that B, and that's fine. So we can close the blue component down now. You may notice this area of blackness around the edge of the frame. This is just where there's been a slight shift between the images that the telescope was acquiring the data. We don't need to worry ourselves about that yet. We can just live with that, and we'll deal with that later on. So that's not a problem at all. So the first thing we're going to do is click on our R layer, our red layer, and then come down here where we've got R red, R green and R blue, and we right click on R red, and at the bottom it says create spare channel, and it will put that spare channel just down here. But once again, so we don't get confused later on, we right click on spare channel, come up to the top where it says rename, and let's call this red. So that's our spare channel down there. And we're just going to repeat this same procedure for the other 2 layers. So with the layers menu on the screen, come up to the G layer, come down to the green down here, right click, create spare channel. We've got our second spare channel down here. Right click on that to rename it, and let's call this green. And then we'll do this once more for the blue, but it's really important that you click on each of these layers up here before you do this procedure. So we've clicked on the blue, come down to blue, create spare channel, there it is, right click, rename, blue. Okay, that's fine. So we've got our spare channels down here now. We'll do something slightly different. We'll come up to where it says layer and now create new layer. And there it is, you can see it. So we've got 4 layers open now. We'll rename this immediately to RGB. And then we're almost done. There's a little bit more to go yet, but the next procedure we have to do with the RGB layer selected in blue, we come down to our 3 newly created spare channels. We can start off with the red, so we right click on the red, and then down here we've got 4 options: load to RGB red, load to RGB green, load to RGB blue, and this one, the alpha, which we don't need to worry about. So there's really 3 options here. Now we've clicked on the red component, so I'm going to select load to RGB red. Then we come down to the green and we'll do load to RGB green, and then the blue, load to RGB blue. Now I warned you this was convoluted, didn't I? You can see that it's a bit of a long-winded procedure. We're still looking at a stubbornly monochrome image on the screen, but hopefully with a triumphant flourish we can right click on where it says RGB alpha and click on invert, and we've got our RGB file at last. So it's a bit round the houses to say the least, but it has actually produced what looks to me like a pretty good image. So we've still got our 4 layered image up here. The RGB image we've just created plus the red, green and blue layers, we don't need those anymore, so we can just come up to document, flatten, and it's just reduced it down to our RGB layer. Now I strongly recommend at this point to save this file, because you don't want to have to go through all that procedure again. So let's just do that. We can do, well, let's export it actually, that's probably the easier way to do it. We can do file, export, we'll save it as a 16-bit RGB TIFF file, export. Yeah, this can go in here for now, so let's just call it send a RGB. That's fine. So at least that's safe now. Because we've exported the file rather than doing a save as, we've still got the original file called untitled here, but we don't need this anymore. We've saved the image hopefully, and we can just close it down. It will alert us to the fact that we haven't saved it, but we can say we don't need to save our changes and click no. So then we can open our new image. And here it is. Okay, that's the hard part done. The creation of the RGB file is the hardest part. Now we can combine this with the luminance component to create an LRGB image. Unfortunately, this is the same procedure that we use in Photoshop, and it's very, very straightforward. So the first thing we need to do is open our luminance file. Yeah, that's looking good. And as always, this is a monochrome 16-bit file. We need to convert this into an RGB file. And as before, document, convert format, and just change it from grey 16 to RGB 16, and then click convert. As always, you don't see any changes, but it just means this can now receive the colour data. So here it is, our recently compiled RGB file. I'll do Ctrl+C to copy it into the clipboard. Open our luminance image again, Ctrl+V, and it's been pasted on top. We could call this RGB, and if you prefer you can call this luminance or loom, just to keep track of where everything is. So as before, we've got a 2-layered image now with the RGB data sitting, if you like, on a higher level than the luminance component, and these images aren't communicating anyway at the moment. We need to do one final step just to get the two to blend together, and it's the same as in Photoshop. you come to where the blending modes are, and there are actually more blending modes in Affinity than Photoshop, but the one we're particularly interested in is quite a long way down. It's called Colour, and these are blended now. That's our nice LRGB image, so it's looking really nice. And of course, once we've got to this stage here, we can crop the offending rogue pixels from the bottom of the image. Just bring this up like that. Maybe just crop it slightly just in case there's anything else going on around the edges. Got plenty of room with the galaxy in the middle of the frame, and that's it. At this point I recommend you export this image, keeping the actual 2 layers intact, and the way we do that is File, Export, and then click on PSD. This is Photoshop's proprietary format that enables you to save the 2 layers. All of these others are absolutely fine, so we click Export and it just goes to wherever you want it to go, and you can see it's got the PSD extension on the end. Save, and once that's done, so we've saved the image with the 2 layers, and we can come back and start processing this as much as you like from this point onwards. As far as I'm concerned, the image is looking quite good. I wouldn't make too many more changes to this, so we'll probably quit while we're ahead. And I hope this RGB composition video hasn't put you off RGB imaging with Affinity Photo, because Affinity is an incredibly powerful piece of software. And I should mention, at the time of compiling this tutorial, Affinity have a special offer on at the moment with the software available half price. So it's available for the incredible price of £23.99 UK pounds, which really must rank as the bargain of the century. So I'm becoming a great fan of Affinity Photo. For that price, it's an incredible piece of software, and as you've seen, it is very functional, but this particular procedure has been a little bit long-winded, but we got there in the end. In the next tutorial, we'll use a similar procedure to work with narrowband data, because the production of an SHO image is ever so slightly different to the production of an RGB. Not much, but because it is a bit of a convoluted process, I'll run through the complete procedure in the next tutorial. So I'll see you then.